Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 10th episode of the Project Uproar podcast. I'm here, Igor, along with Ryan.
Yeah. And this is, our 10th episode.
We're in the double digits.
Yes. So that's exciting. Today, we're going to be talking about our topic, which is our favorite books. By books, we mean literary books. Our favorite books of literature. And basically, we're talking about why the certain books that we've chosen today have influenced our lives. Now, one of the books Igor is going to be talking about today is coincidentally going to be our book for our upcoming book club. So
Yes.
You'll be able to get a little preview of what book we're doing.
Here's
has it
the
up,
preview right
The Alchemist
there.
by Paulo Coelho, which is a book that I read earlier this year for the first time. I think it was given, someone gave it to me as a gift, and I never read it for a couple of years, and then finally...
It is a common gift book.
Yes, finally I got to reading it, and it was great. So he'll be talking about that. I have 4 books over here myself, very different books. One of them, actually 2 of them were from grad school, and 2 other ones were books that I read years ago, and I'll be honest with you, never made my way through them, which is actually quite funny because one is a very short Hemingway book. I actually considered it a novella. Never finished them because it didn't really have any sort of... I found it wasn't really my thing then. And then this past year I came back and reread the parts that I read before, reread the whole book, and again, had a tremendous impact on me. So I'll be touching on those 4 books. So I don't know if you want to start with one of your books.
Yeah, like we don't have to even be specific with like books we brought.
Sure.
But yeah, we're just going to talk about in general literature and that it can be used to kind of get lessons from and make you think about life and even improve the way you live life. But yeah, we will have some specific examples and we brought some for fun. So The Alchemist, definitely a good book. Make sure to read it. Make sure for the book club that we'll have near the end of the month on it. The Alchemist is great in that it shows a lot of kind of self-development principles within that you'll see later on you can expand upon reading other self-development stuff. But it's not too long. It's like, I think, between 200, 300 pages. And it gets those principles across, like the idea of following what you really want to do. The idea of if you follow your passion and you follow what you want to do in life, you will attract people who will support you on that journey, and people who necessarily don't will kind of separate from you while you're on that journey and stuff like that. Very interesting book. Another book I recently read was Stephen Pressfield's The Knowledge. The Knowledge was interesting because in a way it's the war of art, but in the form of a story, a fictional story. Although he calls it a close to true novel from the best-selling author of The War of Art. So it's based on his life, but there's definitely a lot of like Hollywood-esque feels to it. It's pretty much him going through his own journey of being a writer and constantly giving into resistance. And he talks about how, resistance can come in the way with relationships. Like, let's say you blow up, you create drama in your life, you cheat on your wife or something. That's kind of a way of resistance getting to you. So you're not writing, so you do something else to kind of distract you from your true purpose, which is writing. So we see a lot of that. We saw someone who was working creatively.
No, I was just laughing at resistance, like the idea of cheating on your wife as that form of resistance keeping you from writing.
Yeah.
Is that how he frames it in the book?
He does,
really?
yes.
Oh, wow.
So, because we create drama in part because we're not brave enough to kind of live our true life. You know, we're not brave enough to sit down there and do the work. It's easier, he says, for a professor, for example, to develop an affair than it is to actually like sit down and do what they're meant to do that work. So yeah, it seems extreme, and a lot of Steven Pressfield is like that, right? It's very like extreme, but I think that's some of the power to it. And we have a situation in the story where he works together with another creative person. They're trying to create an album that they will finally sell, you know, hopefully make money off of it. And they're working really hard. Like, they're not doing a lot of other jobs. They're focusing on that. They're so close to being done. And the person he's with ends up actually choking him, like murdering himself, killing himself when they were so close to completing the thing. So it's not funny, but I mean, like, that's how strong he's saying resistance can be. Like, it can literally, rather than going through, he always says it's the most difficult when you're almost done. And that character seemed to be like a parable for that, because they were so close to finishing, and yet he took his own life when they were that close, rather than just like, you know, getting it done, going through, doing the work and finishing the process. So it's kind of the resistance, if you remember from the War of Art book, is that the idea that we're always kind of self-sabotaging. The resistance wants to self-sabotage us, and it'll find ways of using our fear of success really to make us do other things that don't align with our true purpose on this world. And for Steven Pressfield, it was writing, and you see that in this book. So that was another one which I thought is a good read, because you get to read all of these amazing concepts. I said The War of Art is one of my favorite books. So you get to read all of these amazing concepts, and at the same time, you get to see real life examples of it in this book. And like, not real life necessarily, but you can actually put characters to the situations, and he's not just talking in theoretical terms.
Yeah. No, I do like books that focus on the process, and I think that's a topic that comes up as well in The Alchemist, stressing the journey over the destination, reaching the destination. And something I found interesting, just going back to The Alchemist, was the story of Paulo Coelho himself. So Paulo Coelho's been on the Oprah Book Club. He's talked about his life, and his life is very much similar to the boy or young person who is traveling. He wrote this book, The Alchemist, later on in life, I believe, and he tried his best to market this book, and he went on this journey, and no one really believed in him. And then finally someone, I think it was published and it never really took off, and then someone took a chance on him because he said this is a very important book. He felt the ideas in it, and the rest is history. Like, it's, you know, it's a very iconic book. So I very much appreciate the work that Paulo Coelho put in, not just in writing the book, but in trying to get it out there. I'm really interested in that story. And just going back to, like, touching on this idea of the process, one of the books I have here, which is a seminal work, I'm sure most people have heard of it, Jack Kerouac, who was one of the beat writers, him along with Allen Ginsberg, who is a very famous beat poet. He has his iconic book, On the Road. I mean, On the Road has been referenced in many pop culture. It has many pop culture references. I know Russell Brand talks a lot about it, how it's influenced his life. And On the Road is set in the jazz age, which I think is really interesting, because jazz music is all about experimentation, going outside the box, doing things unconventionally. And that's certainly what the narrator, Sal, does in the book. He gets influenced by his friend Dean to leave his conventional life at home and go out and just explore the world, well, explore at least the Americas. And he goes on all sorts of journeys. at times he has a destination and other times he doesn't. He's caring more about living life than trying to attain any sort of fancy title. What's also very influential is he's a writer himself. So you get to see a writer talk about kind of his own process of writing.
Yeah.
And it's just, I find it very entertaining because I think Sal has some, like, he has some traditional values in a sense. Like, he is tied to home, but the way Dean is able to just kind of like, their personalities kind of rub up against each other. I don't think, not aggressively, but Dean is just so different from Sal, and they're just such great foils for each other. And he really is able to break Sal at times out of his shell. And at the same time, Sal also teaches Dean some lessons. And we see all sort of other characters that come out here. I mean, for example, a lot of Jack Kerouac's friends, who were the beat poets, make appearances in this book through other characters. Like Allen Ginsberg is through the character of Carlo Marx. And the language in the book, I mean, this is one of the later editions, but I know, I think Igor, you were one of the first person to introduce me to this book, and you talked about how the original manuscript actually, I believe you said, didn't have any sort of end punctuation in it, or something like it didn't have any sort of chapter breaks. It just was just, you know, a flow of ideas that didn't stop.
Yeah, I believe so. I think it probably did have sentences that end. Now I don't recall perfectly, but I do remember that I think most of the real names of the people were used, and then later changed for like the official version.
Yeah, I believe there were no chapter breaks though, right? It was just one. Like, if you look at the original manuscript, which is interesting because one of the original manuscripts is owned by, I believe he's the owner of the Indianapolis Colts, so a football owner. And he talks about like the profound impact that the book had on him. And, you know, he's not necessarily, you know, he's not someone working in academia. So it's like literature does have profound influence over people working in a variety of fields, including the sporting field, right? Sports are all about the process and taking chances. And that's definitely what On the Road is about. And I think a very influential book, not just for those who kind of like want to travel outside of their hometown, but just those who are interested in breaking away from convention. That's definitely a major topic in the book.
And that's one of the big things I got from that book, as well as Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller, I believe. Or might have, yeah, I think so. And both of those books, yeah, they open your mind. It's kind of like minimalism before I knew what minimalism was, right? Because they don't rely on a lot of luxury.
No.
They rely on experiences, doing stuff they want to do, going from, let's say, job to job that doesn't pay super well, but it allows them to get new experiences. It allows them to do what they want, which is travel, which is not have the freedom to not go to a specific job that they kind of went to school for, and now they're kind of stuck in that job for the rest of their lives, kind of thing. They have that freedom, and they use some of their time to do stuff like write, because they're writers. So I like that idea, and that's kind of why I wanted to bring up Jack Kerouac, even if you didn't bring that book, because when I read that book, this was eye-opening for me. And I think that's the power of literature, which I mentioned before in previous podcast episodes, which is that you can actually use books to get new insights on possible templates for how to live your life. So we are given, like, from the time we were born, specific template of how to live life. So go to school, get a good paying job, a safe job, if that even exists, and then you work at that job until you retire at like 65, you know, or whatever. Hopefully you make it that far, and then you enjoy the retirement, hopefully with your, you know, family and stuff like that. So that's kind of the template we're given when we're young. And the society seems to, and even our family, even though they mean the best, can often perpetuate that as like kind of the only possibility you have. But then there's something like, you know, I read this book And I'm like, no, there are alternatives. You can choose what you value, right? Minimalism was all about that. Choosing what you value most and then focusing on that while, let's say, not focusing as much on stuff you don't care about. So here, they're focusing on how they're living their life. They love that freedom. They love that ability to go anywhere, write about it. They don't have to do a specific job that would keep them in one place. They'd have to be kind of stuck within it. No, they have that freedom, and I really like that because I respect people who develop a passion that's kind of like a side hustle, or they have different jobs to make that money, but they keep doing it. And a lot of writers were like that, and eventually they succeed. They get big enough while they were doing these odd jobs to be able to quit that and be full-time doing what they love, working on their passion. So this book, in a way, was one of the first where I read when the characters were just, going with the flow. They were not worrying about how prestigious their job title is, right? They were willing to work any jobs. I remember in one scene, I think he's working in like a field, and he didn't care about the way necessarily he looked in front of others, the opinions of others. What mattered was what's important to him. And I really like that way of thinking, and not just, following kind of the beaten path, which a lot of us think is the only option, the only template. And let's say getting a mortgage, getting a safe, quote unquote, safe job, and just kind of sticking with that. So that's one of the reasons these books are like, I love books so much, because every single one gives you a different perspective, a different possible template for how to live your life. And you can choose what resonates most with you. And even in Game of Thrones, I believe Tyrion Lannister says that, when you read, you experience many lives, while when you just live your own life, you have much less perspective, much less knowledge, much less like experience than when you can experience all of these different lives through books, which tend to be much more kind of, in a way, intimate, and in a way much more informative than, let's say, films can be, which are often geared towards action and often are limited by the amount of time they have to actually show you the story.
Mm-hmm, for sure. I'm looking at another book here, which the language in this book is very different from Kerouac's. Mm-hmm. This is Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. This is Hemingway, who, has been, if you go on YouTube, there are a lot of videos about this writer, right? He had a very interesting life, very interesting writing process. Mm-hmm. But Hemingway is someone who's very famous for writing very simple prose. By simple, I mean like he doesn't dress up his sentences with fancy words in them, mm-hmm. Which I find is very interesting because he's such a prolific writer, but he writes very I don't want to say to the point, because there is another short story, I believe it's Hills of White Elephants, which it's all about not getting to the point of something, but he is very okay with using plain language, which I respect. And this book, The Old Man and the Sea, is all about this old man who is at sea for many days and can't catch any sort of significant fish. And this old man is followed along with this young boy named Santiago, who, interestingly enough, is the name of the boy in The Alchemist, who I believe is in another Paulo Coelho book called The Pilgrimage is also the name of that. So Santiago comes up, I notice, a lot in literature.
Would you recommend The Pilgrimage as well?
I didn't like it as much as The Alchemist. It touches on some very similar stuff in The Alchemist, though. Mm-hmm. So I did like it, but it was very predictable after reading it was like just reading kind of another version of The Alchemist. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so The Old Man and the Sea is about this old man who can't catch anything, and this young boy is with him who's kind of learning about the life of a sea person, and he sees this man struggling, and he very much sympathizes with him. And he's this old man who's struggling with health problems himself, and he gives this old man different resources to help him by. It's very much a story about loyalty. This young boy is going and helping this man, empathy, understanding this man's struggle. And this boy never gives up. He doesn't say you should stop doing it. He tells him to keep persevering. And eventually the narrator, the old man, I don't think he's the narrator. The old man ends up finding a catch, and it's this giant catch, and he ends up struggling for days to reel this fish in, and the fish won't give up. And eventually, I think the old man agrees that if he catches the fish, he will not eat it because he has so much respect for this struggle that the fish came up with. Eventually he does catch it, and I think the fish is dead, so he ends up bringing it in. But then on his way coming in, he gets surrounded by a bunch of sharks, which end up destroying some of the boat, end up eating the fish. And so he comes back with literally, by the time he comes back to sea, he comes up with literally nothing, like bones of this fish. He's all tattered. The young boy ends up finding him, thankful he's alive, and ends up tending to him at the end. So yeah, it's a very short book, but I really like some of the topics that are covered, like loyalty, like persisting with this fish, the idea that like just because you're going through something tough, like the old man not getting any luck, doesn't mean an opportunity can't come out of that. And an opportunity does come out of it. He doesn't end up getting what he wants in the end, but I think it does make him a stronger person, and it teaches him some valuable lessons, and it teaches the boys some valuable lessons as well.
And you.
Yes. And I think also, even though this may sound weird, but I feel that, and I don't want to make a broad statement, but a lot of times we don't necessarily appreciate, especially like the elderly people, for the experience they've been through in life, right? We just think experience in terms of like credentials, like, oh, I respect this person because they have 5 degrees, instead of I respect this person who may have no degrees, but they're 70 years old, they've been through a war, and they have so many stories to tell and insightful lessons. So I like the idea of this idea of like respecting older people for the lessons and knowledge that they can bring us, because so often we may think when you become a certain age, you become kind of useless, right? You have nothing productive for society or for the young, and this is something that definitely counters that.
Yeah, and that's one of the beautiful things too. When you read books from different perspectives, all of a sudden you start to change the way you look at the people around you, right? So before, when you might have just like not even noticed, you might be talking to an elder and then be like, okay, I have newfound respect for what I can learn from his insights because of this book, which taught you, there is a lot of experience behind that. Well, you might not have thought of that at all, otherwise. True. And what the fish is eaten, right? I think the bones are left, right? But he has that story, right? Yes. He had that experience, and we have that story kind of too. And that in and of itself is kind of like the beauty of it, because, in life too, the final destination is death, right? So we're not, and even when you have a final destination, which is like something else, like making a certain amount of money, it doesn't really matter when you hit that. It's more of the journey along the way. And sometimes if you hit it, doesn't even matter, but it's just like attempting to and enjoying the journey while you're actually going about it. And I believe that that's super important, and literature teaches us that as well, especially literature like I think of Norwegian Wood, which is a book I enjoyed reading in university. And what I liked about that was, besides the fact that it ends in a way that's not definitive, and I like those endings that are like, seem almost random sometimes where they ended it, seems like things aren't necessarily resolved. I like that because it reaffirms the fact that life is about the journey and not about getting to some place where everything is tied up and the wedding happens and there are no more problems, like how Hollywood movies or rom-coms sometimes depict it. In books, you often have a situation where you end off kind of just as confused as when you started reading, and then it's still enjoyable though because you enjoyed kind of the adventures they went on. And sometimes for me, there was this theory, the School of Life. Who runs that?
Alain de Botton.
Yes. So he, for example, had this theory they talked about that we look in literature or in art in general for stuff we lack in real life, right? So stuff that's a bit lacking in real life, we look for that in literature. And for me, when I was doing university and I was like so worried about grades and I was like studying for a lot of essays, both studying for exams and doing a lot of work around essays, I enjoyed reading like Norwegian Wood because the main character did not care that much, you know, like he just kind of flowed through life and he was just like reacting to stuff around him. And he did study a bit for like exams, but he was like, you know, not a straight A student. He didn't put too much emphasis on that part of life. So to me, that was just like almost gave me permission to not worry as much about grades in school when I read about characters who don't. And I find that reading those kinds of books can be very beneficial and relaxing for me because it takes kind of the pressure off me having to be like a straight A student or something like that.
Well, yeah, and I found interesting as well, you said how when you finish reading a book, sometimes you're more confused than when you started, or it doesn't speak to you in a certain way that you thought it would.
Yeah, and even if it does, though, it's a confusion that's deliberate. It's not like an accidental one. It's like you enjoyed the book, but you don't know what's going to happen next in the book. You know?
What I find interesting is like even a book like Norwegian Wood, like similar to On the Road, at a certain point, the book, I couldn't, like, it wasn't having a sort of impact on me, so I departed from it. Norwegian Wood's another example. I remember it's a book you recommended that spoke to you, and you spoke so highly of it, and then when I read it at the time...
Yeah, I like Murakami as an author.
Yeah, I couldn't finish it as well. I didn't like the way, like, I didn't like him as a stylist, and I couldn't finish it.
Well,
but then
it is a translation, though.
But then when I went back to it, I believe a year ago or so, I went back to Norwegian Wood, and it spoke to me very profoundly. Like I really liked some of the topics you talked about. I appreciated the struggle that the character went through with I believe it was the suicide of his former his friend.
Yeah.
And so like it spoke to me in such a way at another point in my life that I wasn't really connecting to prior. So I just love that idea of how books, like any form of art, right? They just can change you a second or third time around, or a fourth time around, or you know, they may just come to you at a certain point in life and teach you something that they never taught you before.
That's right.
I love the idea of going back to even stuff I read in high school and seeing like, wow, like this speaks to me in such a different way. Not that it didn't speak to me before, but it means, you know, X, which it never meant X to me before. So I really like how books can shape you in different ways as you get older.
Exactly. And I agree with that 100%. Just because you didn't like a book once, I remember I had that with Pride and Prejudice. I tried to read it alone before I ever tried to read it in university. And I started and I was like listening to an audiobook version, and after like the first few chapters, like I'm just like, okay, this is, you know, I didn't finish. I didn't keep doing it. I didn't feel motivated to. But then when I came to it later in one of my final years of undergrad, all of a sudden, like we read it in that setting, you know, in the right setting at the right time. And all of a sudden, Jane Austen became one of my favorite authors, you know? So it's very interesting that stuff that you didn't respond to that well at the beginning, and maybe you had preconceived notions and stuff that also got in your way, but then when you come back to it later at a later time, it speaks to you. Just like with self-development writing, you kind of said before you didn't believe in it, you didn't like it, right? And a lot of people would be like, you know, why waste your time on that?
In the words of Holden Caulfield, it was phony.
And it's funny, it's like a lot of pessimistic people think that way, but I mean, it's healthy to have some skepticism, right? But then later, if they get more open-minded about it, like you did, you come back to it, and all of a sudden you like it a lot and you're willing to do like a podcast about it. So I agree 100%. Books tend to also find us in like a really good time. Like I was just thinking again about how perfect that timing that you gave me the War of Art was. And like I gave you a book and then for like Christmas or something, and then you're probably like, okay, I gotta get him something too.
Yeah.
And then you gave me the War of Art. And like I had just started not even a week of like writing every day. And that was the first time I ever did something like that. So I probably wouldn't have kept up with it. But the War of Art like got my ass in gear. And then I was like, all right, this is true. Every time I feel this is resistance, I have to sit down, do the work. I have to be a professional. And that book, through you, through the universe, came to me at like the perfect time, which I'm thankful
And who
for.
knows, maybe if I give it to you or you came across it in third year, you would have, laughed at some of the idea. Like it's just, sometimes it's amazing how books come during a certain point. Like you said, you were trying to get started on something that was unstructured, right?
Yeah.
And it helped a lot.
It depends also what kind of is going on in your life, because I remember some stuff that I resonate with a lot now, and some like speakers, motivational speakers, if I listened to while I was in school, I was like, oh, I want to be doing this. Why am I in school? I kind of had resistance to even watching it because I felt bad because I was in school and I couldn't like implement it as much.
Yeah.
But now I'm like, I'm not in school. I can focus on the business, and I enjoy listening to tips from like other businessmen and entrepreneurs like Gary Vee a lot more. And I get a lot more from it than when I was like closed off and I was like, no, I'm in school. I don't have time for this. Right. So yeah, definitely.
For sure.
And I'm excited to hear about Atonement too. I got at least two more to mention. But.
Yes. Atonement by Ian McEwan. This is a book that when I was in grad school, I took a course, and I actually wrote 2 papers on this book, which I've never done that before.
Couldn't stop.
I couldn't stop, and the professor was like, "Yeah, you could read it. You could write on it twice. That's fine if you're that passionate about it." But I mean, equally as good as the movie. Like the movie is amazing.
I didn't even watch the movie.
The movie is amazing, and so Atonement is about a girl she's the girl on the title, named Bryony, I believe is the pronunciation, Bryony. And it's kind of I don't want to say a coming of age, but it charts different points in her life. So it starts when she's young. She's living with her parents, and she gets her cousins, I believe, end up being brought to her house to get looked after because their parents are going through something difficult. So her cousins come to live with them. So it's her getting used to living with these new people at her house and struggling to, become social with them. And what ends up happening is the significant parts, it's divided into different parts, right? So I believe there's like a part 1, part 2, part 3, etc. So in part 1, the most significant part is when she ends up seeing, there's someone who works at the house, who his name I believe is Robbie, and she doesn't really like Robbie. She doesn't like this guy who's there, and he has like a romantic kind of interest in one of her cousins, and she does as well. It's mutual. And what ends up happening is she ends up seeing one of her cousins getting raped, I believe, in a forest, and it's by this man, and the man is not Robbie, it's this other guy. But because she hates Robbie so much, she goes home and makes these allegations saying Robbie raped her cousin in the forest. So what ends up happening is she gets believed. Robbie ends up going to jail for, I believe, 3 years. And
what
his
happened
life,
to her cousin?
The one who gets raped?
Yeah.
Like she's too young to even understand, I believe, who even did it.
Oh.
She's just, she goes through this experience. So his life gets turned upside down, and she kind of knows that it necessarily wasn't him, but she's also young, so can't really process things. So that's how kind of part 1 ends, and then it moves quickly into the future where Robbie is serving in a war, and he is serving with it just talks about his experiences at war and how he's gone through significant psychological experiences, and he forgets important things, and he's mentally unstable at war. So it shifts to his perspective. Which is cool is like the narration changes, which I appreciate. And then it shifts to later on when Bryony is now a nurse serving in the war, and she's going around to all of these different wounded soldiers, and she's tending to their wounds, and she starts reflecting on Robbie and what she did to him when she was young. And she's gone through a lot of significant psychological damage because of the war. So it goes back to Bryony, and at the end, it's her in her old age, and it's very meta at the end. It talks about how she's writing this book in order to write it as an atonement for what she did to Robbie. So she's writing this book as this way to admit what she did, and at the same time, it's basically like artist therapy, which I really like that idea of artist therapy, right? The idea of producing some form of art to work through something. So I really liked how it ended, and it really, when you get to the ending, it really gets you to rethink, oh wow. So firstly, because it's revealed at the end that she has some form of dementia, does she even recall this stuff properly, right? Because are you saying that like...
Yeah, unreliable
Yes,
narrator.
unreliable narrator. Is she even recalling this properly? Is she making the whole thing up? And if she is recalling some of it properly, how much is it real? How much is it fake? So it really throws into the question, it really brings up the idea of the unreliable narrator, and just how, memories change, memories shape us. So I really liked the ending of the story, how it throws the whole story for a loop. And I remember being in class and a lot of people being like, I can't believe that McEwen wrote this ending. Like it ruined things, but it just complicated things so much. Now it's like, do we even take the book at face value? But I love how literature can do that. Exactly. It can get us to question everything, right?
Yeah, and Life of Pi actually did that too,
yes.
Right? With the situation where it's like he gave all the necessary information, made it more interesting, and then you question like, should the truth always be valued above fiction if fiction can maybe get even deeper truths across than real life can?
Yeah.
So that's also fascinating, and I've heard that brought up like in a few pieces of literature, and I like that. And another thing literature can do is make us put stuff in perspective and make us realize that our own issues aren't as big of a deal as we make it out to be. Because when we're, as human beings, we tend to kind of make ourselves the center of the universe. And let's say something like an exam can seem like a big deal, or an essay can seem like a big deal. But then we read about these characters who are like in life and death situations, or falsely accused and spend their life in prison, like Shawshank Redemption, or characters who are going through difficult times. And then all of a sudden we can read this, get more perspective, learn from their lessons, but also get more perspective on our own lives and be grateful for all of the opportunities we have that we might not be grateful for if we didn't see different perspectives and just took everything we had for granted and at face value.
And what else it could teach you is looking at some of the faults and flawed characters, we learn about some of our own flaws, right? Like I'm reading a book right now by William Dereshowitz, who's the guy who wrote Excellent Sheep. We talked about that book. He wrote another book all about Jane Austen and the life lessons he's learned from her novels. And he talks about Emma and how much he learned about her flaws, her judgmental, her being judgmental, her trying to screw things up for other people, how he was doing that in his own life when he was 26 years old. And really reading Emma taught him so much about how almost not to live during some other parts. So I really like the idea of sometimes how we think like characters are like ideals, but at the same time, we get other characters who are very flawed, and we learn how we're making those same mistakes in our own lives.
Aha, that's perfect. So it holds like a mirror
yes.
to ourselves.
Yes.
And then we have to maybe see that for the first time, that we're actually guilty of this.
Yes, we see it through another character.
And so we change as a result, hopefully. No, that's fascinating. I didn't even think about it from that perspective. But yeah, it's true. And even like I read David Copperfield, and that also puts in perspective like, you know, poverty and what a lot of people are going through, and shows necessarily how not to act. A lot of the rich corrupted characters in those books act very in Charles Dickens books act very cruel, right? And then we can see that as examples of to make sure what we're not doing. And we can see that people went through difficult times, made it through, you know, didn't give up. And we can be reminded of the idea that this too shall pass, right? Eckhart Tolle talks about that. Like, even if we're going through a difficult part in our lives right now, it will eventually get better one way or another. So keeping that in mind and knowing that, you know, things are always changing. So yeah, maybe a perfect situation won't last forever, whatever that means for you, but also a difficult situation won't last forever. And sometimes we get so stuck in our head and in the immediate circumstance that we don't know that we don't see that, think about that. But yeah, that's true. And literature definitely puts that in perspective by showing us usually complete lives, or at least a larger portion of people's lives, and it's not stuck within like one day, although sometimes it is for experimental reasons.
Choice.
Yeah.
Yes.
So to me, that's very interesting too. Did you want to mention, Ryan, anything about Fight Club, since that's definitely inspired this podcast?
Oh, sure. See it in your
that's
pile
one of
there,
that's one of
yes.
my piles. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, no, I mean, I love the Matrix-esque ideas in it.
Explain that though.
Well, by that I mean just
living on your own terms rather than on society's terms.
Yeah, and you know, the thing that really, I mean, I loved about the film as well is just that, again, that turn at the end when you realize Tyler is him. Right, I love that.
Yes, we'll have to put some like spoiler alerts.
Yes, yes.
But
no, I mean, I love that idea, and
yeah.
and just the focus on even like psychology in the book, the dual personalities, right? Questioning what is true, what isn't true, right? Based on because I believe it's a first person narration, right? So yeah, going back to that unreliable narrator. And yeah, just so many things. Like I remember someone, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek talks about what he loves about Fight Club is the violence in it. And he says, because the violence is like, he doesn't just take it as, you know, literal violence. Like he's not just loving, especially in the movie, the parts where he's just beating himself up.
Yeah.
But the idea that like he is he's trying to beat out conventional kind of ideology, right? He's trying to beat out the social convention out of him, right?
Yeah.
And especially the part when he's beating himself up in front of his boss, right? And it's just like he blames his boss for doing it. It's just like, yes, like his boss has basically destroyed the man that he was by forcing him into this box, right? Even though he's done it himself.
Yeah,
he signed up for the job.
Machine, yeah.
Yes, it's kind of this pointing to how he's this cog in the machine,
Yeah.
right? So no, I mean, I love, you know, both the film and the book. I mean, what we could turn to you now, like what do you take
yeah
from
it's funny because like I feel like a lot of the stuff that I really enjoy, the books I really enjoy, now that I know what minimalism is, has a lot of minimalistic principles within it. And this Fight Club definitely has some. It has the idea that, you know, you're not your job. People tend to over-identify, you know, let's say you're a writer. It's like, I'm a writer, right? I like, you over-identify with what you are, or I'm a teacher, or I'm, you know, a professor, or you define your identity based on that. But there's more to who we are than like our status, than our job titles, than our, you know, furniture, our clothes, stuff like that. And Fight Club is great because it focuses on that stuff. Obviously, it gets right. Not all of it should be taken literally. Some of it should be taken metaphorically, like, you know, beating yourself up. You know, that's probably not necessary. But yeah, it makes us question society, and it leads, especially in the initial parts, they make a lot of good points. Whether they go about addressing those points in the correct way, you know, destroying like stuff that is beautiful and stuff like that. And that is not so obvious. That is not so clear. Like obviously, you know, you shouldn't condone that kind of behavior, but the initial questioning of the system and the initial faults they see with the idea of working at a job you hate to buy shit to impress people you don't like that is a great lesson that the book and the movie really get across well. And knowing that, you can completely shift your life. And it's always good to have actual examples rather than theoretical concepts to put your beliefs into. And that's another reason fiction is so good.
Mm-hmm.
Another book I was going to just recommend, we could come back to Fight Club in a bit if you want to, but this is actually a manga. So I thought I'd bring up one manga, which is kind of usually source material for anime, although some anime weren't mangas at first. But it's called Honey and Clover. And a lot of what this one taught me was, so it's like mangas are like comic books, but like Japanese. And a lot of what this manga taught me is just being okay with letting go. With like one of the characters is in university, not sure what he wants to do for the rest of his life. He likes a girl, but she doesn't really like him back. But yet they're still friends. And it's a question of unrequited love, and yet it doesn't even bother him after he confesses that he likes her. And she says, you know, like she's not really into him, but that doesn't bother him. He did it. He took kind of the initiative to go for it. And later he's not sure what he's going to do, but he has that feeling, you know, things will be all right. And it's okay to not know where you're going all the time. And I think that's a great lesson. And I watch that anime and read the manga pretty often because, yeah, it's important to remind yourself you don't need to have everything perfectly mapped out, even though sometimes it feels like we do, right? And sometimes it's okay to not be completely sure where you're going, but just enjoy the journey, enjoy the process. So in that way, manga and anime have really also shaped my life, just like literature, right? It's pretty much can happen with most forms of art, especially storytelling forms of art.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think it widens our understanding of what literature is, right? Mm-hmm. Like oftentimes we think literature are just the canonical works, but no, I mean the way works are nowadays, like we question what belongs in the category of literature or not. I definitely think the manga is categorized under literature. And I'm not that well versed in it, so I can't speak much about it, but for sure we talked about it last week, there's some very deep topics that are talked about in a lot of the animes and in the mangas. And
comic books as well. Mm-hmm. Like if you look at, was it called Mouse?
Mouse, yes.
Yeah, the graphic novel.
I believe Spiegelman.
Yes, and about World War II, right, mm-hmm. in concentration camps. Like you get these preconceived notions, a lot of people do, that comics, manga, and cartoons are for children. But yeah, you get these authors talking about really, really important topics that are very serious, right? And adult topics. And people should keep that in mind. Yeah, these stuff like Mouse should definitely be viewed and given the respect of being viewed as literature, mm-hmm. and not just, you know, like a comic book in the way that most people kind of use comic book as a loaded term to mean like not
lowbrow.
Yeah, exactly.
Stuff. Yeah,
exactly.
For sure. I just wanted to go back very quickly to Fight Club.
Yeah.
When you talked about titles, because that's actually very related to my last book here. I love how he goes to these different support groups for various ailments, mm-hmm. like testicular cancer. Mm-hmm. And he goes there not to be identified as someone who has it, because he obviously doesn't. He lies about it. But he goes there, I think, to just like experience like being in a group that is talking about kind of like universal suffering, right? Like mm-hmm. It's like no matter where he goes in the groups, they're all talking about the same thing, how to cope in life, right? And I find that interesting how he uses these titles as a way to talk about or just listen to other people talking about suffering.
Yes.
And about how, they're lost in life. They don't know what to do. And so, yeah, Fight Club for sure has a lot to say about titles. And this last book I have here, which is a book probably not many people have heard of. It's a Canadian book. Vincent Lam, who is actually a medical doctor. And it's a very interesting story about how he published this book. He wrote the book. I don't think he had any literary experience before writing the book, right? He's a physician, so it's not like he, went to school to study literature. It's not like he was in any sort of literary circles. He ended up meeting Margaret Atwood on a boat, and he told her about this book idea, this book that he wrote, and she immediately, pardon the pun, jumped on board and, very much spoke in his favor. And she actually, I believe, writes some sort of comment at the beginning talking about the book. But the book is published by Random House, which is crazy to think this guy with no experience published Random House,
Margaret
which is
Atwood vouching for you,
yes, which is a very prestigious publishing agency. But anyways, the book is all about a guy and a girl from Asian descent, which I believe he is as well. The one is Fitzgerald, the other one I think is Chen, and their struggles growing up. So basically it starts by us learning about how they are both striving to get into medical school, and they don't really have like a purpose. Like it's not like they want to get into medical school. They kind of feel the pressure from their parents to get into medical school, and so they kind of just jump on the bandwagon, and they're like, okay, I guess this is what we want to do. So it talks about their stress in school, having to sacrifice a lot of things to study for the MCATs, I believe it is, right? And so it talks about their struggle. And the cool thing about this type of book is not technically considered a traditional novel. It's called a short story cycle, which a short story cycle is a book that contains different stories, and these stories are all related to each other. So they have similar characters or the same characters, but they're just about different events. So it's not like they logically or chronologically progress, right? There's one story that let's just say the second story, that may have happened when someone was in their 30s, and the very next story is when they were in their teenage years. So it's not like there's a chronology. They're all related in some way through the characters. And so the thing I liked about this book, was the idea of how these characters, these young people, you see them growing up, you see them struggling to fit in, both as, like, I believe immigrants to Canada, but as well as people who are trying to they're trying to become a conventional success, become a doctor, right? You ask anyone, what's the most prestigious career? A doctor, right? Oh, my son or daughter is going to be a doctor.
Exactly.
Right? And so they're chasing this title that they don't necessarily want. And you see at the end of the book, not only are they both, I believe actually Fitzgerald passes, it's been a little while since I've read this book, a few years, but Fitzgerald, I believe, ends up passing away because of an illness. But you see at the end, Chen ends up living this miserable life. She's married to this other doctor, and they live this miserable life where they get absolutely no sleep because of their job. And you just see how the idea of chasing something that you didn't really want, or even not even taking the time to think about what you want, because they're just pressured from their family.
Belt,
yes, right? Just stepping on the conveyor belt and never stepping off or looking back, just going forward, right? It talks about the dangers of that. And I'm interested to see if Vincent Lam had a similar experience, if he's actually writing about himself. But it's interesting how you see, it's, again, going back to looking at literature for the flawed characters, right? And I could read this book and I could be like, wow, I've been through similar things. I've stepped on the conveyor belt and not stepped off and thought about things. I just wanted to chase a title or chase something and get there as quickly as possible, right? There's an emphasis on speed in the book. There's also this emphasis on, like, woundedness, right? These people going around and tending to wounded patients, And really, like, the characters are like mentally wounded, but they're like covering it up. They're like trying to put a band-aid over things, right? Just like trying to get these titles and not really think about what they really want. So I really appreciated that. So it's not necessarily an international, well-known book, but it did win. If I look at it, it does say, I believe it won the Giller Prize, which is a prestigious Canadian award.
Yes. Yeah.
So it did have a lot of success in Canada. So definitely a book, if you're not from Canada, to check out, because I think it has a lot to say. And it's a very readable book. This was actually assigned when I was a TA to first year students. And I can't tell you how many students came to me in seminar and like people from other fields outside of literature, like the sciences, and said, this book had a significant impact on my life. So
Yes.
hearing people like from the medical fields or, sociology saying, wow, this book was amazing, it spoke to me like no other book we read in this course, was a cool feeling.
No, yeah, for sure. And I think, again, it's one of those situations where you can look at a character, remind yourself, see yourself in that character, and start to hopefully question the matrix, as you put it, before it's too late. And you found yourself like, ideally, it's never too late. You want to start wherever you are. But yeah, it's definitely helpful, especially for university students. I think that's a great first year book to read to make them think a little about the way they're living their life, because often we're just rushed from trying to get into university, right? Working really hard, to university, working really hard for good marks, trying to get into graduate school or, medical school and stuff like that, that we don't have time to actually stop and think about the way we're living life.
Yeah, and that's actually why the two characters, they have feelings for each other, but eventually they mutually decide, or at least I think the girl initiates it, but I think they mutually decide to not see each other anymore because they're like, we don't have time to focus on our feelings. Like, we have to just keep going on the conveyor belt. We can't step off and like be like, we're going to take time to get to know each other. We have to just go as quickly forward as possible to get into medical school. And eventually they both drift their separate ways. So you always wonder about what could have been there, because they both were facing a very similar struggle. If they actually just acknowledge the struggle instead of just ignoring it and going forward, you wonder what could have been.
Exactly. And sometimes society like kind of tells us, it's objectively more important to, get good grades or to do this. But yeah, those kinds of books make us question what's most important to us. Is it getting that job and making that money, or is it being with that person we really care about? Right? And that's a great question that everybody should ask themselves, and not just default into kind of what society is constantly telling us through different ways. I agree with that 100%. And just, I was also going to mention about the Fight Club. It's also the self-development idea when they're in the groups, kind of the cancer patients. And it's the idea, I think, that it's drawing upon the notion that it's good to be close to death. That's like in self-development circles, because it reminds us of our mortality and it makes us feel alive to be close to death, ironically. So I think that's one of the reasons he does that as well. But I'm very interested that you brought up this book that I didn't even know about. What's it called again?
Bloodletting and Miraculous Cures.
Exactly.
Which, interestingly enough, there's a lot of blood, physical blood in it. There's also, there's wounding, both physically but also mentally. And yeah, cures is a very interesting word, because we think curing is like, okay, like it's fixing something permanently, or it's like healing someone completely. You're cured of something. But really what we learn is that they're never actually cured of what's ailing them psychologically, right? It's something we see at the end of the book. She could barely even get to work anymore because of how much her job has drained her and how much her lifestyle has just killed her soul.
Yes, and it's like when you get that respect, when you get that money, what can you do with it when you're like, let's say, too busy working, or how much money do you really need, and is it worth all that? And I think that's a great book, and I'm definitely gonna read that.
And we think so often doctors, just like any other prestigious professionals, have everything together.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Have
they
it
definitely,
set.
and just because they know what's physically wrong with us, but obviously they may not have, physically things together, but also mentally as well, right? Physicians go through a huge amount of stress and depression.
Oh yeah, I can't even imagine. Like I knew I could never be a doctor because of like the amount of stress it takes to just deal with those situations, cutting people open, dealing with the situation of just telling people, possibly horrible news, right? I mean, it better come with a big paycheck because that is a difficult job to do.
And you wonder how they could even handle it.
Yes.
Like, or if they can't, like maybe they can't.
And
maybe
it should be
you don't,
respected
you don't
because
see that other side.
yeah, they're practically heroes that they go through that and they bear that all on themselves. It must be crazy difficult.
For sure. Now, did you want to speak about
I also wanted to just say how you mentioned before that you read The Old Man to Sea and you realized that old men might have a lot of experience that we can learn from. And I also wanted to say that a lot of these books, literature, even nonfiction, self-development, right, they are written by people who have often experienced like a lot, right? They've experienced sometimes 50 years of life, sometimes more, sometimes less, but a lot of experience is jam-packed into these books. And I think that's another hugely valuable thing about books, that we get to in a way learn from all of their experience by reading these books, which people don't believe that there could be that much value in like a $10 book, but there's ridiculous amount of value. And more so I'd say than, let's say, depends on the film, it depends on the book, but in general more so than going to paying even more to watch like a Hollywood movie.
Yeah, they're definitely timeless, right? And just because they're written during a certain historical period or about a certain person doesn't mean lessons can't be learned from there.
No,
right?
and that's what me and Ryan are also kind of training ourselves to do now, to look at those lessons within stories, because often we aren't, for whatever reason, trained to do that in like literature in general. We're trained to look at motifs, metaphors, stuff like that, but not necessarily how this can actually be used in my real life and how I can benefit from it. You don't see essays written on that often.
No. And what's interesting is there is like a certain movement in certain literary circles or schools where it's just like we have to read only or mostly recent books that talk about contemporary issues because other stuff is kind of outdated, right? Like we're not going to go to Shakespeare, or we're not going to go to Joseph Conrad to talk about, something like racism or something else because that wasn't understood back then. Like, so it's like, no, it's like this stuff is definitely prevalent. That's what I loved about Jane Austen and the professor we had, was that we learned that there are so many contemporary issues being talked about Jane Austen. Like one thing was like animal rights, and it's just like that's like a contemporary social issue now, like the idea of like not purposely going out and torturing animals, right? That's like a moral wrong, and like that's a big thing right now, especially look at like places that are protesting against marine parks and zoos. And it's just like what's interesting is like Austen was talking about or making allusion to that in her books at the time. So like these books, it's not like the writers were like not necessarily like they were writers of their time, but there's a certain timelessness with them.
That's right. I agree 100%. And I feel like that's something that literature has that sometimes maybe like, let's say, science doesn't. Science can get outdated, much quicker than literature, which is about the human soul, human feelings, human relationships, which really never change. Like I told you about how when I was reading the book on Stoicism by Seneca, that it reminded me like what he was saying, like I'm like, this is exactly what we're experiencing, it's written way before. And we have issues of empathy, issues of self-centeredness, issues of race. We see all of that in older texts that still apply right now. We can still learn from that right now. So yeah, that's definitely something that's true for literature. It's like a time machine, pretty much. I heard a professor compare it to that recently on a YouTube video, and it's like time travel. You get to see not only what life was like, but how people viewed life, which is very useful for, again, gaining that also important perspective, so we're not stuck in our own subjective reality where our daily problems, everyday problems, are like seem like the biggest thing. No, we see that people have gone through what we're going through way in the past. They made it through it, and it's been this human experience that we can trace back as far as we can trace back literature.
Yeah, definitely. The way we understand literature and the way we understand scientific theory are two contrasting ideas, right? Theory is all about in science disproving old concepts and like trying to erase them as quickly as possible, whereas literature is all about going back to these past stories and appreciating their value.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is about like science is often stuff that's discovered through philosophy or developing oneself is often, not viewed with the same respect that science is viewed. But yet as science progresses, they start to see that there is a lot of value in these teachings. Like, for example, meditation. Often, scientifically, you wouldn't necessarily expect meditation to have good effects, especially in like maybe 100 years ago. But today we can see with brain scans that, yeah, it is actually much healthier, and you can build certain muscles and stamina and, be able to live a better life if you meditate a certain amount every day. You have less chance of getting certain diseases and all of that. So science caught up with that, but really it was around way before science accepted the benefits of meditation.
Yeah.
So it shows how that definitely we should look into philosophy, look into literature, even when it's not backed by science, for example.
For sure. Now, did you want to plug the book one last time?
Yeah, we'll plug the book one last time. Again, Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist. We're gonna link it in the description. It was one of the first self-development books I read. It's very good, very good for beginners, but also to go back to it. I know a friend who gives it out whenever we go to like a book riot where they kind of sell books for really low prices. He gets as many of the Alchemists as possible and just gives it to his friends. Like, I'm sure all his friends have copies already. So it has definitely changed lives. People feel passionate about it. And like Ryan said, he got it as a gift. So people definitely believe in its ability to change people's lives. So I can't kind of praise it enough. And we'll talk about it.
And it's a work of fiction, which is different from our other book.
Sometimes, yeah.
Well, it's different from the other two books that we have looked at so far. So it goes to show that like personal development stuff doesn't have to be in the form of, nonfiction or quote unquote. It has to be in like the self-help section, right? It could be literature as well.
Yes, it can be literature. And that's what, and I feel like you can find it anywhere. You can find it in movies. You can find it in daily experiences. But yeah, I'm very excited for that one. And I'm excited to go back to it because I haven't read it in a while.
For sure.
All right. Well, until next time, thank you for listening, everyone.